Good evening. Welcome to First Parish. My name is Ann Mason, and I am honored to be the 23rd settled minister here at First Parish in Lexington. We are starting tonight our 325th anniversary celebration of our existence as a congregation here on the Battle Green in Lexington. And I'd like to take a moment to say thank you to all the people that helped to make this evening possible, especially all the members of the History Committee, some of you are sitting here this evening, especially Lou Counts and Maureen Beauvais, who worked tirelessly to get our exhibit mounted. They went exploring into the archives of the Historical Society, and they breathed their share of dust. So for that, we are very grateful. I'd also like to take a moment just to acknowledge that our document exhibit this year is dedicated to the memory of Bill Smith, who was a valued member of First Parish and who passed away very suddenly as he was working on this event with us. And so you'll see an acknowledgement and a plaque with his picture on the exhibit. And so we just acknowledge Bill and his love of First Parish and our love of him. So thank you all for being here. We are still a living, breathing, wonderful congregation, and we have been that way for 325 years. So to introduce our guest speaker tonight, I'd like to call up Lou Counts.
Good evening. Tonight is a very special night as we kick off our celebration of 325 years. And we're fortunate to have Sam Doran with us. Sam is a historian, a native of Lexington, grew up in the town. I know his family well. And he also is a Minuteman, so everyone needs to behave well tonight, or we will be taking public confessions. So please mind yourself. Sam has extensive knowledge of the history of this town and of First Parish. And he also continues to serve us all as working as a reporter in the State House in Boston. So I give you Sam Doran.
Thank you, Lou. Lou mentions my connection to the Minutemen. That feeds into a little bit of research that I'll share this evening as well in connection with the 1690s, which is the decade we're focusing on this evening. That part of the late 17th century when the farmers of Cambridge Farm, farmers is what the inhabitants out in these parts of Cambridge were called, sought corporate powers for the purpose of establishing a ministry, a church. And establishing their own town government wasn't yet at the front of mind. It was a minister and the power to select them themselves and not have to go those 8.5 miles or what have you into Cambridge Common. That's what motivated them. Avoid that long walk every week. But Lexington was the great frontier in the 17th century. And it's amazing how quickly it developed, how quickly this part of Cambridge was populated. At first, prior to the 1640s, what was out here but grapevines, hence Vine Brook, woods, some alewives in the Great Meadow, and members of the Nipmuc Indian tribe roaming through the woods hunting. These were hunting grounds. On their way on the path which is now Mass Ave out to Musketaquid in Concord. There was no distinct religion, just to touch on religious activities of the Nipmucs, no distinct religion of that tribe or of any of the native people, according to a project of Harvard College to identify the religious history of Massachusetts through the years. Instead, they had no distinct religion, but religion informed their daily practices and customs, and it was something sort of interwoven with all they did. But along come the English, and in 1642, Benjamin Muzzy is the first colonist to make his way out that old hunting path which by this point had been widened by the colonists as they first settled Concord. And then Benjamin Muzzy makes his way out here, builds a house on the banks of Vine Brook, where the Edison station is today in Lexington Center. By 1650, we have 30 people living out here in less than 10 years, and that would rise from 30 people to 30 families by the time we first petitioned in 1682 for our own parish, our own right to have a minister out here. Now, these original settlers, with the exception of Muzzy, who starts out right in the center at a tract of land owned by the Herlackendens and then the Pelham family, and they hire Muzzy, who's from Chelsea, to come out and farm the land for them, because a condition of their getting this grant from the proprietors of Central Cambridge was that they had to improve the land. And rather than do it themselves, they hire Muzzy, send him out here to do it. But most of the settlers, most of those 30 people by 1650, are living along the borders of what is now Lexington. And they had come over the line from Watertown, parts that are now Waltham and Belmont, or Concord, the part that is now Lincoln, Billerica, the part which is now Bedford, and you can see how those towns were also eventually divided and carved up into other townships. Now, these folks who settled along the borders of present-day Lexington most frequently traveled roads which led back to their old homelands where they still had family members, or these were the areas that were still their economic centers. So for the Harringtons, who came from Watertown, they would most frequently travel the road back into Watertown. Or for the Winships, who settled along what is now the Arlington line, they would travel back along the Great Road into Cambridge, or what then became Menotomy and now Arlington. So these were their most frequently traveled roads, although a good deal of them also went back to this governing municipality in Cambridge, back to the church once a week on the Sabbath, which, as I said, was about 8 miles, 8.5 miles, depending on what part of Cambridge Farms you lived in. By 1670, we're at 90 people. By 1682, 180 people, 30 families, and still traveling every seventh day. Now, as far as what's going through their minds at this point, because we can talk about the distance and we can talk about the numbers of people, but one historian from the early 20th century, Helen Clark Fernald, really, I think, captured what they were feeling on a weekly basis very nice. She says, "One sees the people of that far time on a raw morning in December, starting for church in Cambridge 8 long miles away. The farmers are helping their families into ox carts and up on the backs of horses. The women and children are quaintly dressed in thick homespun dresses, tight-fitting hoods, the men in leather breeches and rough coats. The sleet of a New England blizzard stings their faces, but still they've got to go to church or face the tithing man's punishment, right? They are numb with cold long before the end of the journey, but they have no thought of staying at home, for these men and women and children of stern religion are compelled to go to church unless sick or too old." And so this was a hardship for the farmers. Their petition is denied to be set off as a separate parish, in part because Cambridge benefits greatly by having this large tax base that extends out into Cambridge Farms, and having that go toward the church and the ministry at Cambridge Common. In 1684, we appeal to the Great and General Court. It is denied. But public safety, as ever, is an important issue. And in 1689, we got not a church nor a school at this point, but in 1689, the Governor's Council grants us our own military company. And so, separate from the Cambridge Company, we now have our own officers out here in Lexington. Shortly after the Glorious Revolution and the overthrow in Boston of tyrannical New England Dominion Governor Andros, by the local militias, and with a threat of Indians still on the frontier, not too far away, just go up to, say, Sudbury, and that's a concern. Lexington gets David Fisk as their first military commander. And so this does save the men of Cambridge Farms from having to go into Cambridge every so often for training, for muster days, that sort of thing. By 1690, we have 256 people. So 180 in 1682, 256 in 1690. Finally, our petition is granted, third time's the charm, on December 15th, 1691. And this is a petition of the farmers and inhabitants of the farms. And what they were seeking was, quote, favor and license in order to the calling of a minister for dispensing the gospel among them. And, secondly, also to be a district village, their own quasi-government within the town of Cambridge. So what was there for community at this time in 1691 into 1692? From colonial history, as we get toward the Revolution, we often speak of the center of village life, the center of the community out here being the tavern, Buckman Tavern or Monroe's Tavern. Buckman isn't built until 1710, when it's built by the Muzzy family, descendants of those first settlers. So at this point, there really is no center to the community. And folks are still, as I said, going back to their grandparents' towns, Watertown or up into Billerica and so forth. So it is this granting of the right for a ministry, our own parish, which first brings people together into the center of town. And then in 1711, we acquire from the Muzzy family the common out there. Our first church had been built on a little piece of what is now the common, but the bulk of that common meeting area for the military company to muster or to be used as common grazing area or where stocks could be set up or a pillory post. All of that is not acquired until the church brings everyone to the center. Now, what's one of the first things we do, or the first thing we do when we're set off as a parish, but elect the parish assessors. In essence, they're the selectmen, they're the governing body, but they're the assessors because, first and foremost, very important issue, then as always, is the taxes of the region. And that's a concern. We need a tax to pay the salary of the parson. We need a tax to raise money for his house, the parsonage. He's to be paid £40 per year. 20 pounds of that is to be in kind, or firewood, some food, produce, so forth. A tax to keep up the responsibilities to Cambridge, such as upkeep of our share of upkeep of the Great Bridge, which leads from Cambridge into Boston, where what is now JFK Street, there out of Harvard Square. And that's how the folks from out in these parts got into the market every week in Boston to sell what they had to sell in town. So we did continue to pay for that because it was a utility that we used. But as far as raising money for the meeting house here in the new parish of Cambridge Farms, it's not a tax, but a subscription that we use. And this is rather interesting. And Charles Hudson, a member of this parish and one of the first town historians who writes the history of Lexington, he calls special attention to two lists from this point, 1692. List of the first folks assessed for taxes to pay for the salary of the minister, and the list of the voluntary subscriptions to raise money for erection of the meeting house, where the Minuteman statue and Hayes Fountain is now. And if you cross-reference the lists, it's generally the same people from rich to poor, although the subscription list does include some family members and folks who had been involved with the community in prior years who pledge money even if they don't live in the community any longer. But generally, same list of people and proportional giving. the wealthy folks who are taxed the most are also donating the most toward the meeting house, and the poorer pay proportionally as they're able. But generally, this voluntary subscription seems to have worked out rather well for them. In 1692, April 22nd, the parish votes to call Benjamin Estabrook, who had graduated a couple of years before from Harvard College, as the first minister to start on May the 1st. It was a clear vote, the records report. And in 1693, following year, they build him a simple house, simple rectangular house where the boiler room of the Carey Memorial Building is today. That's why it's named Estabrook Hall down there in the basement of the Carey building. They discovered as they dove down, the foundation for the Carey building was flooding, and they had to dive down to set foundation and so forth, and discovered the timbers left over from the foundation of that Estabrook house in 1927-28. So there's Estabrook's house on the banks of Vine Brook, and in 1696, October the 21st, they formally ordain Estabrook. He serves but 9 months until he dies July the 22nd, 1697. And he's buried just behind us in the old burying ground, one of the, well, I believe it's the earliest tabletop tomb in the cemetery, the grandest of its time for colonial Lexington. The parishioners thought a lot of him. It had been a decisive vote which brought him in. He was mourned across the parish, and even when Charles Hudson writes of this years later, Hudson had been an ordained, I believe, Universalist minister himself, but as a member of this congregation, in his History of Lexington, he writes a lamentation with exclamation points and sorrow, as if this death of Estabrook had just happened the day before, and it rocked the fledgling parish. It took them several months, but November the 7th, they invite John Hancock to be the second minister. He does build his own house, what is now the Hancock-Clark House, or the original structure stood slightly behind it, then added on the present one. It's Hancock who remains for 55 years, Jonas Clark after him who remains for 50 years. The parish got more stability after that initial upset with Reverend Estabrook. But we were just commenting in the other room how remarkable it is that, Anne, I believe you're number 23, you said, and over the course of these 325 years, to have only 23 ministers speaks to the longevity of the, well, it explains, as we were saying, why history might still mean so much to this congregation, and why so much of it is remembered and passed on. And as we look to the case in the rear of the church here, we see a footstool and a dictionary from Daniel Harrington, the Minuteman who fought in the Battle of Lexington, lived right next door to this church. And the first time I walked in here, what was the thing I noticed? But those ancient relics displayed in the church itself. So these things are not forgotten, and the tenures of folks like Clark and Hancock have certainly lived on and had an impact. I was mentioning during the question and answer session in the other room before this talk also the style that some of the ministers had in those early years, and how they were able to keep parishes like First Parish united for so long. For unlike several other communities around this part of Massachusetts or of New England, we didn't have a split, and while remaining a Unitarian church, there wasn't an Orthodox church that immediately broke off. Hancock doesn't come along until the 1860s, I believe, and that's because of this all-encompassing, welcoming persona that the minister took on. Hancock, as is noted in that exhibit back there, Reverend Hancock, has an amiable tone in trying to resolve disputes, make everyone feel heard, and indeed, years later, when Reverend Clark's protege, Joseph Estabrook, himself a Minuteman also, had fought in the Battle of Lexington, then been ordained as a minister, graduated Harvard, and became the minister in Athol, he saves that town from a contentious split during his pastorate in that town, using the same techniques of when a theological question comes up that seems about to divide the town, he seeks to make everyone feel heard and encourage them to look at the broader picture of why they're here, to be a community, to worship a God, and to put aside smaller grievances and disagreements. And so I think what I would most like to close with is another writing from a member of this parish, James Finney Monroe, who became an author in his spare time, one of the final owners of the Monroe Tavern before he and his brother left it to the Historical Society. But one of these books he wrote in his spare time was called The New England Conscience. And he picks several stories from colonial New England to try to get across the persona of those early Yankees, what they stood for, what sorts of moral codes they had. And in the introduction, when he defines what he means by the New England conscience and this Yankeedom of early years, well, he closes his introduction with some reflections on where the New England persona was at as of that writing about 100 years ago or so. And he points to social organizations as the influence of churches in a community, church and state separated, as we noticed in the other room in 1833 here in Massachusetts. Other denominations pop up. By the early 20th century, some people don't go to church. As that influence on the town wanes, he points to social organizations and other forms of community that fill the same function, that still fill the same role years later in modern day as the church first did in Lexington in 1692. And he says, our churches may be emptier of worshipers than when the tithing man held legal sway, could be fined or forbidden communion for a time if you didn't attend. But our streets and houses and offices are fuller of the real presence of God. The women's clubs, the men's gatherings, the various social organizations of which every American hamlet has at least one of, signalize the final emancipation of New England and the New England spirit from the reign of selfish individualism, which sought only its own salvation. So he likes to think that the spirit of those early ministers and of the folks who founded a parish such as this one live on in the same sort of community that we still feel in a place such as First Parish in Lexington Center. So thanks for gathering together tonight, and wish you all a very happy 325th here at First Parish.
Thank you, Sam. That was just amazing. The Vine Brook flows by my property, but it's now a trickle. It's hard to imagine what it must have been. Sam can take a few questions. He told me he has to go back to work. He's working hard for us. But I also wanted to remind you that General George Washington and the Honorable James Madison will be here on the 16th of November. And if you would like tickets, we have them. They're free. But this is an event not to be missed because they will be discussing the church and the state. As you know, Madison worked with Jefferson to create a separation of church and state. So we will hear directly. But Sam, you said you'd answer a couple of questions.
I will. And I'll also plug the Honorable Mr. Madison because I've seen him myself in person, and you don't want to miss President Madison. He's a great portrayer.
They may be starting their journeys now because they're coming by carriage here from
It's a long
Virginia,
way.
which is a ways off.
Yeah.
Sam, questions?
Yes.
If the redcoats had shown up more around, say, 8 o'clock in the morning rather than 5 o'clock, would it have been full of cows and goats and everything on the green?
I'm not sure what the arrangement was in 1775 in terms of how they were using the common or how the time was divvied up, but that's an interesting question. And at some points also they would pause the grazing to grow hay there and auction the hay off and that sort of thing. But I thought you were going to say what would happen if something like that had occurred decades earlier. And I was just going to circle back to when I mentioned the foundation of the military company here in Cambridge Farms. That was really a direct response to that uprising of 1689 in Boston, which had, it's interesting if you ever get a chance to read about the Glorious Revolution's ramifications in Boston and Governor Andros, a lot of the same sorts of writings were being written at that point, a lot of the same language that you would later see anti-tyranny stuff pop up in the 1770s and 1760s. So a lot of the same sentiments about the British had, this isn't an answer to your question, but I just think it's interesting to share, a lot of the same sentiments in regards to the British government back across the ocean did exist to some degree locally here at the point that this parish was established.
Sam, as I think I've heard, you had services in the morning on the Sabbath and again in the afternoon. And then there was a Thursday night service also. 9 miles from Cambridge Farms to the center of Cambridge there at Harvard Square. That's a good 2 hours on a good day.
Right.
Traveling. So you can understand the pressure from the farmers who lived here to establish their own parish. Why that long delay for the 10 years? Was that just Cambridge's objection?
I believe it was, and I don't know as much as, say, Charlie Bowen, if folks get a chance to chat with him about, he dove into the denials and the appeals of the farmers, and so he might know a bit more detail of that than I. But I believe it was Cambridge that most strenuously objected, although ultimately it was the Great and General Court and the legislature or the governor who were hearing these appeals as well.
Okay, we can take maybe 2 more questions and that's
Sure.
it.
Sam, you work there now, so I'm sure you can answer this one. Why is it called the Great and General Court, our legislature, here in the Commonwealth? I'm not going to ask you why we're called a Commonwealth, but
Sure.
Great and General Court.
You know, I don't actually know where the name came from, other than now it's a holdover of colonial days, and various forms of government are holdovers from colonial days, like the Governor's Council, the Executive Council, and likewise are some of these terms, like the Great and General Court. Yeah.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I've not heard a good answer, though.
I'm curious about the development of the name of the name of the church. Was
Sure.
There was only one church, so it was just church, or did
Or
they say
the
Cambridge Farms?
Church of Christ. I've seen Christ Church in Lexington, Church of Christ in Lexington, or in Cambridge Farms, as the case may be. But they would place the name Christ usually prominently in that.
Okay, because the word Unitarian didn't come till much later.
Right, yeah, yeah. And in between there, before this became the Unitarian Society or the First Parish Church of Lexington, it was the First Congregational Society, I believe, for a time. And then the name changes to distinguish from, even though it's a congregational style of government, as is Hancock Church, distinguished from the denomination of Congregationalism.
They called themselves Congregationalists before the present church, present Congregational Church came to be.
I'm not sure the exact year that it would have changed from the congregation. It was the Congregational Society while Unitarian, I believe. But that was the form of government, right? We met together as a congregation and self-governed and made decisions as a deliberative
They can have
body.
all the names.
Yeah. On the cornerstone out there, right? Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Sam, we want to thank you for an excellent, informative presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Excellent. Thank you.